This is the October 3rd, 2019 work session. Colleagues, thank you for joining me this afternoon for this work session. We're here to review the fall supplemental budget, more popularly and more commonly known here at City Hall as the fall bump. I'll be filing my proposed supplemental budget ordinance next week. Today, the plan is to review and discuss changes which are requested by each of the bureaus. As you're aware, the fall bump is primarily meant to address technical adjustments to true up budgets between fiscal years. Bureaus, of course, can also appropriate new resources or request general fund contingency for urgent and unforeseen needs that can't be accommodated within their current year budget. With that, I'll turn it over to Jessica Kennard. She's the director of the City Budget Office, who will walk us through the supplemental budget requests and the recommendations. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, members of council.
Excuse me, Mayor and Jessica, before you start.
You bet.
Mayor, what would be your pleasure? Would you like the presentation to be fully completed first, or would you like questions throughout?
Questions, this is a work session, so my personal preference, and others may disagree, my preference is, given that it's a work session, let's roll our sleeves up, relax a little bit, ask questions as they come up.
Thank you.
And
In other words, a free-for-all.
A free-for-all. And my belief is, in this free-for-all, we have plenty of time set aside. We have 2 hours set aside if we need it. My guess is we won't need that much time, but we should feel free to have interactions and back and forth.
That's right. Thank you. So as the Mayor mentioned, I am Jessica Kennard. I'm the City Budget Director. I'm here with Jane Marie Ford, who's our Supplemental Budget Coordinator, and we're going to walk you through the fall bump. The structure for today's work session. So I'm going to start by reviewing pertinent changes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Carla, is there a way to turn that up just a bit?
Should I just speak closely?
Seems
Can
like
you,
the
is
sound
this
going
better, or
up,
is this?
We're not getting it.
Let me try that one. All right, is this better? Oh, that is better. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So the structure for today's work session, I'm going to start by reviewing pertinent changes to city financial policy. We'll then review the general fund requests that are in front of you. We will follow this by discussing general fund excess balance and unrestricted contingency balance. We'll then discuss proposed general fund appropriation level target adjustments for next budget year. So bureaus can bring forward requests to change their appropriation level for next year. So we'll talk about those. And then we will discuss briefly non-general fund notable changes, and finally position changes. So please feel free, again, this is a work session, so jump in at any point with questions. And then of course we can have a more in-depth conversation at the end if the questions aren't answered throughout the presentation. So I just wanted to start off by discussing some of the updates to city financial policy that council passed in April of 2019. So there were a few changes that impact the fall bump. So per financial policy 2.04, general fund contingency shall be used for the following: for 5-year balancing, for mitigating overhead revenue and shortfalls in future years due to true-up process, for paying down existing debt, and for urgent or unforeseen needs or emergencies in the fiscal year. So this language, what we did with the update to financial policy in April was we actually codified what we had been doing in practice for a number of years with our contingency resources. And this language was essentially codified to reinforce good financial practice. It's meant to preserve the ability of council to respond to urgent needs with contingency, while also ensuring longer-term commitments are considered holistically with ongoing needs. Why I'm raising this for council now is because of the change in the language. What it means is that if council wishes to include an allocation of general fund contingency that does not meet that criteria, we will need to include, we will need to waive financial policy as part of the supplemental budget ordinance. Additionally, financial policy updates included language requiring bureaus to submit specific information along with any requests to allocate their own contingency resources or general fund contingency resources. So we asked all bureaus, if they requested contingency resources, to demonstrate their efforts to reprioritize funding within existing appropriations, to include an assessment as to why internal realignment of funding was not possible or recommended, to evaluate equity impacts both for city staff and on community outcomes, and to identify how budget request ranks relative to the Bureau's highest priorities. So we asked for, again, the bureaus were trying to move towards the direction of codifying some of the things that we've been trying to do in practice, and bureaus have responded and provided a lot of great information through the fall supplemental budget. So in total, at a high level, Bureau submitted 233 decision packages containing distinct requests for council consideration, but most of these requests were technical in nature. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually less than what we've had in previous years. And I just want to highlight that that I think bureaus really took it upon themselves to adhere to financial policy and really try to only ask for urgent and unforeseen needs. In the past 3 years in the fall bump, we have had new general fund discretionary requests totaling anywhere from $8.7 million to $20.6 million in requests. This year, bureaus only requested $2.6 million. So I think that's a really huge win that I want to thank and champion Bureau's efforts to adhere to financial policy.
Yeah,
in their
I want to
requests.
second that because I believe Bureau leadership heard our request to really make this about unforeseen and unexpected and emergency circumstances. There are a few items that we need to discuss as a council that may not quite fit that bill, but I want to really acknowledge the Bureau leaders who are here in the room today for your hard work on that, because I know there are asks that you would have liked to have made in this process that you're holding off until the actual budget process. So thank you for that.
Great. So as in the past, CBO's recommendations for allocating new general fund resources in the bump focuses on how the request aligns with financial policy. And then we also look at whether the request is fully developed, whether it's one-time in nature, and whether it can be absorbed reasonably within the Bureau's existing appropriations. Because of this, you'll note that typically CBO is pretty conservative with our recommendations for the allocation of resources. But this does ensure that there are sufficient resources available for council to allocate for other emergency or urgent needs throughout the course of the year. And then also, CBO has recommended in the last couple of years, and we will recommend again this year, that council consider utilizing any excess balance or contingency resources and preserving it for needs that we know will come about in the next budget cycle. So with that, I'm going to turn to walking through the general fund requests. So this is a document that has sort of different shaded rows of data. It begins with our requests for new general fund contingency resources. Let's see. So in addition, I want to call out there's a column for Bureau requests. These are what bureaus have requested. There's a column for CBO's recommendations. And then you'll note that in a couple of instances, there's no Bureau request, but there's a CBO recommendation, and I'll explain why that is when we get to those items.
And Jessica, I was just reminded by my chief of staff, I should put this on the table, that these are simply the budget office recommended items. There may be a few other items that are going to come to council that are not included in the CBO analysis. So I just want to prepare you for that reality.
And to that point, Mayor, when will your proposed recommendations be made public?
That's next
You'll be filing, I believe, next Tuesday is the
Tuesday.
filing deadline?
Very good.
Yes.
And when will it be up for a vote?
The following Wednesday, the 16th.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a little bit different than the last couple of years, where in the last couple of years, we were discussing the mayor's proposed supplemental budget. It's more open-ended. We're actually just discussing the requests and CBO recommendations today because he has not yet filed his proposed. Okay, so the first item that we have on a new request is the Office of the City Auditor. So they're requesting just over $233,000. This is needed following a court ruling in June that upheld the new campaign finance regulations that were passed by voters in November of 2018. The initiative was passed by voters, but then it was held up in court, and then it was finally upheld at the end of the fiscal year, too late to accommodate with the budget development process. So this did meet CBO's definition of urgent and unforeseen. So CBO is recommending the equivalent of 18 months for what was requested as a limited term position to help modify the system that the Bureau uses around campaign finance to make sure that it can accommodate these new rules.
And this is one-time money, right?
Correct. This is a one-time
And
allocation.
this is for honest elections, the ballot measure, not anything connected with our program.
Correct.
This
Then
is
it-
honest elections, not open and accountable elections? Okay.
Don't confuse the two.
All right.
And accountable.
So the next item is a request from the Bureau of Emergency Communications for overtime costs associated with training folks up on their new ProQA system. This is one-time costs to train all call takers and dispatchers on this new system that is going to be coming online. This is urgent and unforeseen. It was unforeseen because the Bureau actually, it's a good thing, they achieved full staffing far earlier than they thought they were going to. In their initial plan, they thought that they would still have a number of vacancies so that they would be able to cover the cost of this training through their vacancy savings, but they're actually at full staffing earlier than anticipated, so they don't have the vacancy savings to be able to pay for this overtime. So, and it is a required cost to implement the system. I will also note that the system is critical to any sort of Portland Street Response initiative that we need going forward, so there is an urgency around this as well, which is why CBO has recommended the funding here. I will note that there is typically a split between the general fund portion and our regional partners. And so the regional partners will be reimbursing the general fund for their share of this cost.
And their share is half, is that correct?
No, it's about, I think about 21%.
And what's that based on?
I would have to ask our Director of Emergency Communications to read that.
Hey, Bob.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Bob Causey, Director of BOEC. The funding formula is based on population of the municipality. So City of Portland is 79%.
Okay. Thank you, appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. The next item was requested by the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. This is a request to co-fund a county study for mitigation and implementation strategies for the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub. So this is an infrastructure hub that is a risk to the city if they have a large seismic event. CBO did not recommend because there are other resources within the Bureau's budget that we recommend that the Bureau look to utilize for this purpose. So they have a federal grant that is an eligible source, as well as a regional disaster preparedness organization might be an eligible source as well.
Jump in.
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, I would say, thank you so much. I appreciate the work of the Budget Office so much, but I would say that is a misstatement to say they have other funds that could support the fossil fuel study that Multnomah County and other government entities are also putting $50,000 into. It is clear that this is a critical issue for the city of Portland and for this region. And if forced to, I guess other choices will have to be made. But I just need my colleagues to know that if we're ever going to get to a fossil-free future, we have to know exactly what direction we're headed in. So this is not just about my bureau, but this is about life and safety in the city of Portland.
Jessica, could you just say again what the other possible sources that you identified were?
There is an emergency management performance grant that the Bureau receives on an annual basis. And then there's a regional disaster preparedness organization that the Bureau also convenes and allocates grant funding for.
So how likely are those sources to materialize? Do you have a sense of that?
So the sources are in the budget, but the question is whether they're programmed for other events and other needs, and what the trade-offs would be within the Bureau to reprogram those resources towards this effort.
And how can we find that out?
We will ask the Bureau to provide a trade-off analysis if we do not have one.
Because I assume those resources are being deployed elsewhere,
Would you
and
wanna
I'd
come
sort of
up?
like to know where they're being deployed.
Skia, would you mind sitting over there? Thank you.
Good afternoon.
The record, Kia Cannon, City Budget Office. In speaking with the Bureau's financial manager, my understanding is the EMPG grant, which is the Emergency Management Preparedness Grant that they get every year, is estimated to be $336,000 this year. It's a little late in its arrival, which is why the Bureau has not allocated that resource at this time. It should come this winter, so that is one possible resource for them. In addition, because this is a regional project, we really do feel like this is a really well-qualifying project to be applied for through the RDPO, the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization. And then the third source that we talked about in the analysis is that the Bureau typically averaged about 12% of general fund underspending over the last 3 years, which could be a possible resource as well to fund this. My understanding from the Bureau is if the EMPG grant comes in and they wanted to still move forward with this as a project, they would use the EMPG grant to backfill general fund resources for which would be allocated to fund this study.
Okay, so one thing that would be helpful for me as I put the mayor's proposed, or the mayor's bump schedule out for next week, could you give me a sense, or maybe give me a couple of options, including what would an intra-bureau loan look like, and how likely are you to receive these funds? And
The EMPG grant funds?
Yeah.
They are committed already. They
They're
just
already,
are not
and what are they
received.
already committed to?
They are committed to coming into the Bureau's budget. They are not allocated out. These
No, I
funds are
get that,
usually.
but I need to know specifically, and yeah, I don't need to know right this minute, right this second, but I need to know if we decide we want to allocate some of that 336
Yeah,
to this purpose, I need to know what's falling off the plate.
Okay, we will get that to you. Thank you.
I think one of the critical issues that we will be facing is that at the same time we're doing emergency management planning, we need to desperately do that. That's what will be falling off the plate, is that we will be making a choice between whether or not we're putting our plans in place or whether or not we're kind of piecemealing how we would be able to deploy folks in a real emergency. So I do think it's a critical conversation for us to have, especially in light of trains coming through our community with no drivers, hitting bridges, and the other things that we are confronted as we think about what's happening around this fossil fuel infrastructure.
Can I just make an observation? This is my 40th bump. I'm trying to think, Jesus. This is, I'm just want to say this, speak out loud and have Jessica affirm this if this is your understanding. But as we go through the list today, it is the right of any council member to flag something where they have a disagreement, to put that on the record and put the argument before. They then have the opportunity to sit down with the mayor and convince the mayor to put it in his proposed, which is the first bite at the apple. If the mayor chooses not to include it for whatever reason, they then have the right to bring an amendment and try to find 3 votes on the council for that matter. And so that's how it generally plays out. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
People are absolutely allowed to challenge my proposed bump. They have the right to be as wrong as they want to be.
Okay.
Shall I move on? Okay, so the next one is one that was not requested by any bureau. It was actually put in as a CBO recommendation. This is, these are the general fund, an estimate, initial estimate of general fund obligation related to remedy design work, including payment to the trust for Portland Harbor Superfund. So this is an issue that we know is coming forward. It's a known liability. City attorney is working with BES, Water, and other partners around how to tackle this liability. But we know that there will be a general fund obligation in the next fiscal year, and so our office is recommending that we take this opportunity to set some of these resources aside to make sure that we start addressing this liability.
How did you come up with the number?
It was an initial estimate that is being discussed with the attorney's office, is sort of looking at a way of sort of divvying up the cost by fund based on location of the needed work and former property owners.
Jessica, just to be clear, because this is the general fund portion, the conversation has been expanded to include fire, PBOT, and other general fund bureaus that have potential liability here.
Yes, there are a number of bureaus that are implicated, and so what CBO would recommend funding for, at a minimum, is the portion that would be ascribed to bureaus that are typically majority general fund supported or bureaus that are now defunct.
And just so my colleagues are clear, all of our expenditures through the utilities and through the general fund are subject ultimately to a reconciliation, both in terms of what is our liability in Superfund, so we get a credit, and that we may underspend or overspend, but there will be a reconciliation, and then there will be a further reconciliation between the general fund and the utilities in terms of who carries what portion of the expenditures. And that is also consistent with the ruling of the court.
Okay, great. So the next item is from the Portland Housing Bureau. It's a request to create a standalone rental registry system to collect additional data on rental units. This request was considered by council in 1920 budget development. It was also came forward and was indicated that the Bureau was going to request these resources when you all passed the rental registration fee a few months ago. And so the CBO recommendation is that we wait until fiscal 2020-21 budget development, as this will allow more time for us to develop the specifics about which data will be collected, how it will be used, and what the operational and programmatic implications and impact is expected to have of the data that we're collecting. We also would note that it would appear that it's unlikely that, given the typical technology procurement timelines, that the process would be complete before the end of the fiscal year, which is another reason why we would recommend considering it as part of budget development.
Commissioner Hartsty.
Thank you, Mayor. Jessica, I'm curious as to whether or not any work is being done now to identify what those data points are.
Would you like to answer that? We're going to have Matthew Shabold from the Bureau talk more specifically about that.
Hello, welcome.
Matthew Shabold for the record. So we, through the mandatory relocation assistance ordinance, through the FAIR ordinances, through the rental registration requirement and the fee, we have been tracking a lot of the data points that council has asked us to be looking into, and they generally fall into 4 categories of things. It's market factors, unit characteristics, renters, and then kind of a catch-all on potential demographic information. And so we haven't made any determination, but we would be looking at systems that could capture any of those buckets. And then we'd be looking to engage with the Rental Services Commission as well as all the council offices on what data is important to be tracking and what the implications are for the market.
So colleagues, I had asked this to be put up for consideration because there is, as you heard during the testimony around FAIR, many people who came in and supported the FAIR proposal also took the opportunity to criticize the Housing Bureau and the Housing Commissioner for not having the rental registration system be fully in place with unit-by-unit data collection. And so I put this forward. I would not actually argue that it is urgent and unforeseen. I think we're all aware that this program needs to be built out, that this system needs to be put into place. The question was a question of urgency. And what I have learned from the Housing Bureau is that even if we allocate these resources right now, as I've requested, the resources are likely not to be used in the near term. There's still work, as Matthew just indicated, that needs to be done. There needs to be more identification of the appropriate data sets. There needs to be more outreach to the Rental Services Commission and others. So my current inclination is to put this into the fiscal year 2021 budget, our upcoming budget process, and then have a more full process on this. But I at least wanted it on the table, and if people feel differently or feel strongly about it, I'd appreciate hearing about it between now and next week.
Thank you for that, Mayor. For me, it was really about understanding the urgency of the community members who are looking forward to having this resource in place. And so I greatly appreciate you putting it in. But my last question has to do with the $60 per unit charge fee. Is it anticipated that that fee will fully fund the program? And if not, what will those resources be used for?
So based on the partnership we have with the Revenue Division to do projections on the revenue we would anticipate in the first few years, the fee should cover the full cost of the rental services office and the ongoing maintenance for the expanded rental unit registration, but not the one-time procurement costs of the rental registration system.
Okay.
One last question. I'm not sure if you are the right person to ask, but it occurs to me, thank you, Commissioner. It occurs to me that we send notices out to folks for the arts tax, and we actually hound people for arts tax well in advance of when those funds are due. My question is there a way for us to link with that notification system so that we get better information about actually who's out there that should be part of this rental registry?
I would defer to Thomas on the compliance.
Director Lanham, welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Land with the Revenue Division. That may be possible.
Thomas, a little louder if you could.
That may be possible. We do notifications within the arts tax outreach effort every year. That's a mailer that goes to every household, and we may have an opportunity to put an insert in there about this particular requirement. So the filing deadline for the rental registration Schedule R, as we call it, is actually April 15th, so the timing is pretty good for that.
But the arts tax goes to all taxpayer households. That's a pretty big universe.
Right.
What's the universe of landlords?
I think we had, what was the model that we had talked about, Matt? I can't remember how many accounts.
So there are roughly 126,000 rental units in the city, but we don't have an absolute number on landlords. It's part of the reason we need the registration. But realistically, it could be anywhere between 50 and 80,000 landlords in the city.
And of course, another difference is, the benchmark for compliance with the arts tax, if you want to look at sort of the next closest first cousin is compliance with federal tax. And I believe the figure is somewhere just above 70%, 70 to 80% compliance rate. What's different here is that we're going to be, our goal will be a 100% compliance rate, correct, with landlord's registration?
Well, it's unlikely that we'd ever reach 100% on any
I
schedule.
understand, but we have but we also have some hooks. We have some carrots and sticks we can use on that process that are not available to us with the arts tax.
That's true. Ultimately, we are anticipating a higher compliance rate with the rental registration requirement, something closer to the business license tax compliance rate, which peaks out at around 90% cyclically. So we would anticipate ultimately getting to about that spot. That'll be a few years out.
Right.
Right, and I'll just say that the budget office anticipates around a 60% compliance initially. But so I asked that question because I think we should be using any opportunity that we have to actually get information both from renters and the people who own those rental properties. And so rather than recreating the wheel, actually connecting with systems that already do that purpose. So thank you so much, appreciate it.
I have a question. You said something that I may have misunderstood. How many landlords did you say there were?
I mean, it's an estimate, but it could be between 50 and 80,000. We don't know exactly.
Would you say that again? The sound is just terrible here.
50 to 80 potentially. We don't really know.
And is that net of those landlords who are excluded? Or is that all landlords? Is all landlords?
All landlords.
Okay, right, sorry, I'm confusing that with fair. So potentially 1 in 12 of us in this city are landlords?
Potentially, sure.
Wow, okay. It's an interesting statistic, thank you.
Mayor, I hate to bring this up, but
Sure.
we don't have captions.
Why don't we? Where's Carla?
And it's streaming on, oh, well, now we do. All
Oh,
right, very
okay.
good. Thank you very much. I stand corrected. Good.
All you had to do was
Commissioner Fritz, you are very persuasive. You are very persuasive.
Live accountability. It's great.
Okay, let's keep going.
Thank you.
I wasn't hallucinating, because I had my
Thanks,
staff
Thomas.
check,
Thank you,
and
Matt.
there weren't captions before either.
All right, great. So the next one is a request from the Bureau of Human Resources. This is a general fund discretionary request to jumpstart manager and supervisor training across the city. CBO did not recommend this due to ongoing general fund implications, which are estimated at about $54,000. However, we would note that there is also $75,000 that is included in the fall bump for new interagency revenue between the Bureau of Environmental Services, Water, and PBOT that could be used as sort of a pilot for this desired training in the current year. And then CBO's recommendation is that the Bureau engage stakeholders in advance of budget development to come forward in budget development with a more holistic proposal. The next item is from the Office of Equity and Human Rights. This is a request to fund a second citywide results-based accountability cohort in response to training demand. So you'll recall this past year, the Bureau of Equity and Human Rights launched a robust training around results-based accountability with an equity lens. You all were able to receive a training from the folks that we brought in for this. This is in response, again, to demand for additional trainings. The recommendation from CBO is that OEHR work with BHR to develop a fee schedule similar to how other external training costs are passed through. And the reason for this is that a large number of Bureau staff were already able to participate in this, and we think that if there's sufficient demand, then bureaus would be able to opt in to participating in this through the type of training structure that we already have, which is making the training available for a small fee for bureaus.
And I agree with that recommendation.
Okay. So the next item is from Parks and Recreation. This is a request for 5 vehicles for park rangers in their Asset and Development Division. The Bureau intended to purchase some of these vehicles last year, but held off during its spending freeze. CBO did not recommend this request as it was not unforeseen. And the Bureau, I would note that the Bureau did not prioritize the purchase of these vehicles in their existing budget. They have, they do have an existing fleet budget, but that has already been subscribed for other fleet needs. We would also note that the Bureau is meeting the operational needs of these positions by renting vehicles.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yes, please.
I've fortified myself with a cup of coffee and an iced tea, so I'm armed for bear. Claudio Campazano, would you come to the table? Just Claudio's here to fact check me in case I screw it up, and Sonia has prepared a statement. And colleagues, if I could, I just want to walk you through this because I think there's a unique set of circumstances, even though we don't fit neatly into the criteria that has been established. Last year, Council approved funding to purchase vehicles, funding that in acknowledgement of the significant instability in last year's budget, and out of an abundance of caution, the Bureau did not spend. That caution paid off, and the Bureau came in on budget without needing the cushion granted by Council, including $600,000 that was added in the spring bump, or the $500,000 that was set forth in general fund contingency. And both of those allocations are being returned to the Treasury. Through hard work and hard choices, the Bureau gave that $1.1 million cushion back to the general fund. And I want to particularly single out the work of Claudio in bringing systems to our Finance Bureau, tracking numbers and helping us operate within a very constrained budget. In this bump, Parks and Recreation is requesting $194,000 for the 5 vehicles that were not ordered, which would be used by a plumber, a carpenter, and our rangers. These employees are responsible for basic maintenance and upkeep of our parks and facilities and for the safety of Portlanders and our visitors. CBO's analysis, which we do not quarrel with, is that this request doesn't technically meet the criteria for bump spending. We would argue that it's been an exceptional couple of years at Parks, and particularly with our budget, and that last year's spending freeze was the responsible approach, as opposed to spending down every dollar and hoping things would balance out. In other words, we could have purchased these, hoped for the best, but at the end of the day, then used the lifeline that Council set aside for us. Instead, we chose to operate within a constrained budget. We have returned to the Treasury the $1.1 million. I think my colleagues would argue, would agree that that is a more responsible approach than spending with a lack of clarity about whether we could meet our ending fund balance. I'll note that with these vehicles, the Bureau, without these vehicles, and Director Kennard noted this, the Bureau is instead renting which I think we all intuitively understand is more expensive and a less efficient way to meet our need. So respectfully, we ask the council to consider restoring the let me get this right, $194,000 that we have out of the money that we've returned to Treasury so that we can buy these vehicles. And I'll turn to Claudio and ask, did I screw anything up badly?
Nope, I think you got that absolutely right. The only thing I would say is that they can keep the $1.1 million because we actually underspent by about $200,000 more, which would fund this. So the $1.1 million remains underspending that can be captured by the general fund. This was an additional $200,000 that was underspent that we're asking to carry over.
So in effect, Mayor and colleagues, we made the hard choices. We've come in under budget. We're returning 1.1 million. We didn't purchase the vehicles because we wanted to be prudent until we knew we were out of the wilderness. And we're asking that we not be penalized for that and that we have the opportunity to purchase those vehicles, and would ask for 194,000 to come back out of the money we've returned.
Very good. And Director Kennard, I'd like more information on what those vehicles are. And in fact, what would be helpful for me, I know there's reams of data out there, but I'd like to know something about the different categories of vehicle available in fleet and what their utilization rates are. And Tom looks like he has that information, or could get it.
We can get that to you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Claudio.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so the next request is from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. It's related to the Anti-Displacement Action Plan. They're requesting $120,000 in one-time general fund resources for materials and services within the Anti-Displacement Action Plan budget. This includes funding for a position at Anti-Displacement PDX in compensation for community stakeholders. So CBO is recommending that this wait until 2021 budget development. We would note that it does represent a slightly different scope than what was approved by council. Council approved $270,000 in one-time resources for the Bureau to move forward with this anti-displacement action plan in the current fiscal year. There's still work also, we would note there's still work that's being done on a citywide policy, which was directed by council in a budget note around what the right strategy is and processes for compensation for its advisory bodies. Finally, we would just note that it appeared as though the request for the position was ongoing, and so we would just note that would be a concern as funding an ongoing position with one-time resources.
Is Director Durbin here?
I believe that Joe
Joe's
Zender is here.
Mr. Zender, can you give us, I mean, certainly I understand the priority, and I have a chance to speak with the director about why she believes this is a good idea, but can you give me some sense or give us some sense of why the urgency? Why can this not wait until the budget process?
The urgency comes from the urgency of the task to get this project of developing both the anti-displacement action plan and the related task force up and running. Our goal is to have it up and running in early 2020. The premise that we're designing this project around, and it sort of was based on what the direction we got from the direction to develop, is that it's co-created with the Anti-Displacement PDX Task Force. Part of the success in the, and after we were rewarded in the budget, we started meeting with Anti-Displacement PDX Steering Committee, and it became apparent that without these additional resources, the coalition itself was not going to be able to step up and participate, both just practically in terms of the bandwidth of these groups, and also sort of in principle. When the Anti-Displacement Task Force was created and got the policies in the comprehensive plan, they were organized and coordinated by a standalone coordinator that was housed at 1,000 Friends of Oregon. That was funded, I believe, by foundations and private fundraising, but that has gone away. This recreates that capacity, at least for the 1 year funded by the position. The expectation is once we get the task force up and running, this anti-displacement PDX function, which probably will still be necessary, needs to find another way to be paid. But we are jumpstarting the process so that we can be moving along in the timeline of the Housing Opportunity Initiative as well. There was a sense that waiting not having these resources is going to significantly delay our ability to make progress on that anti-displacement work with the task force.
All right, thank you.
And Mayor, if I may,
Please.
it is clear to me that if we are going to do better housing by design, if we're going to do the residential infill project, if we are not investing in ensuring that community members are not displaced now, we will be in this situation a decade from now wondering why there are no low-income people in the city of Portland. And because these projects are going to be coming to us before the end of the year, I am very concerned if we are not visibly making a commitment that we're going to support community folks to be at the table. The presentation we heard said that these community members would be equal partners with city bureaus at the table, and that just cannot happen without resources. So if we don't have a plan to make that happen, I'm going to be very concerned about the votes that we're going to be asked to take later this year that are supposed to protect people in the communities that they're in. So just wanted that on the public record. Thank you.
I share those concerns. I'm also concerned about funding ongoing positions with one-time money, because that really is calling the question before we've looked at what else are we going to be looking at. Is the right, what else could they use the current allocation that we put into the budget for? Could that be used for for this position? It seems to me that we are going to need more funding for all of the action items for the anti-displacement plan. So it would be better to consider it all as a package, and if that means slowing down on residential infill, for example, then I think that's something that we should consider. Because I even if we start tomorrow, we're not going to be able to be ready in time for instance, the implementation of Senate Bill 534, which we're supposed to do by the end of March.
Mayor, if this would help clarify, if it was shown in the request as an ongoing position, that's a mistake on our part, because we are anticipating this was funding this first year, get it up and running. There may be more, but that will be a separate ask at a separate time. This is not an
Yeah, but that's
ongoing
the point.
position.
If it's intended really to be ongoing, it shouldn't be a one-time, and
Right.
that also limits who
it's-
you get in the position
So
if
that's
they don't
a
know if
mistake
it's
I
more than
must have
6
made in
months.
writing this up.
So I think that that's problematic.
I think that is the debate that's in front of us, but I also know that we have set communities up over and over and over again and made promises that we have been unable to keep. And I think if we don't invest in that community stakeholder group early, then the assumption will be, once again, the city is saying one thing and doing something else. And for me, that's a game changer. It's important that we actually walk out talk.
Could I ask a question about the package that we actually did fund in the 1920 fiscal year budget? It was the anti-displacement package. Did it not anticipate community engagement like this?
It did, Mayor, and it has a set of money, a chunk of money for staff positions to do the plan and run the process, and then $60,000 we put aside for payments to or support for the community groups or for the participants in the task force. And we wrote that up before we had our first real convening of that group. In the process between the budget proposal and now, we had the final meeting of the Policy Link work team that the city had put together around anti-displacement, which was fairly successful, but made it really clear the importance of a community, elected, and city bureau decision makers working together on a task force like that. So it made it more apparent to even the coalition the need for the coordinator in this first year.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Commissioner.
So we got 60,000 for this fiscal year for that position.
And we have enough to get started if we can figure out procurement. We don't have enough and we provided with the request this year a closer estimate of what the full position would cost. And the anti-displacement PDX estimates that it's closer to 80,000, plus then funding to support the organizations themselves, and then some administrative costs with the whole project. So the 60 and the 120 gets us to where we believe we need to be for this first year of activity.
So it's 200,000 for 6 months' work.
Well, it's the position's not likely to be hired until January, given procurement and given sort of the budget process, right? The amount of money that we're earmarking now for the coordinator position will last longer than this current fiscal year. We could trim it back so it's just the fiscal year, but we face this dilemma with this coalition who we're trying to convince that we're in to support this work through and asking them to hire somebody who's going to sign on for 6 months.
So let me do this. I think we have more questions on this, and there needs to be a little more nuance to this. You mentioned something that piqued my interest. You said this is to help support the organization. So you started off by saying, Joe, that this was an FTE to help with the planning process. But then did you also say it's to support the organization? What do you mean by that?
It's an hourly or some sort of stipend to support the groups that don't have staff capacity to dedicate to participation in the task force process. So it's that level of support. It's that level of funding for those activities. The main piece of this work is the coordinator to bring the coalition back to a functioning level that we really can get our work done.
Okay, well, I'd like to have further conversations with you and perhaps Director Durbin about this.
Okay.
And my colleagues, Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to remind us that as part of the budget note in 2019-2020, we directed the Office of Community and Civic Life, the Office of Equity and Human Rights, Bureau of Human Resources, and City Attorney's Office to conduct an analysis of current practices and policies providing stipends to volunteer members of city advisory boards. We also recommended that they come back to us in January of 2020 with what their recommendations will be. And so just wanted to remind us that this is not the only community engagement process where we expect community to volunteer a lot of hours to give the city good information. And it has been a problem not just for this process, but for many other processes that we've had. And so I guess my question to the Office of Equity and Human Rights and and the city attorney and all those folks is, are you going to be prepared in January of 2020 to actually answer this question? Hi, welcome.
Hi, I'm sorry. This is Kofi, Office of Equity and Human Rights. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer right now, but I can get back to you.
Because obviously Kofi is filling in for Dr. Smith, and she and I have been having some conversations. They are working on it, which I guess is another reason and was reflected in City Budget Office's advice is let's not get ahead of that, because it would be difficult to then have a citywide policy if you've got one group getting one set of funding. And yeah, so I believe the answer to your question is yes, they'll be coming in January 2020.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I will look forward to getting some additional information on that myself before we vote on this budget. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. So the next request is also not one that was requested by any bureau, but CBO put this in as a recommendation. This is another known liability issue. This one is not as urgent, I will flag. This is payments that we anticipate owing pursuant to the Intergovernmental Agreement for Columbia River Levy. This is an amount that we would need through fiscal year 2025-26. So this is really very much taking a long view. But, you know, we see an opportunity now to take care of that liability if council agrees. So we would just want to submit that for consideration.
Yeah, very good. And this is a known liability.
That's right.
And so I just want to, put my 2 cents in there. I support this. We have the resource, and we know that we're going to be paying this sooner or later, probably sooner. So I think it's actually fiscally prudent for us to reserve that. That's just my current view, but if people want to talk to me offline, I'm open to other opinions.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next one is from the Bureau of Transportation. This is for small wireless facilities. So the Bureau of Transportation submitted, this request contains 2 parts, totaling $253,000. First, The Bureau is asking for $66,000 to fund the increased cost of a multi-bureau study to determine the cost to maintain and manage the right-of-way. Study's already underway, but the cost estimate is increased due to the complexity of the analysis. CBO did recommend funding the right-of-way study increased costs as we felt the request met the urgent and unforeseen criteria for the fall bump. We'll also know that there is value to the city in increasing our understanding of the cost to maintain this critical asset. The second portion of the request was for $185,000 to reimburse the costs that the Bureau has incurred, contract costs for the design and engineering of light poles. So the redesign was prompted by strong demand from private sector for light pole infrastructure in the right-of-way to support the wireless services. CBO's perspective is that while the light pole redesign is not transportation specific, these are reasonable costs for managing the right-of-way that could be absorbed by the Bureau. The next item is from, the next two items, the final two items are from Prosper Portland. The first is a Southwest Corridor Business and Property Owner Survey requesting to allocate $50,000 in general fund one-time resources for a survey of businesses and property owners in the Southwest Corridor in anticipation of the light rail project. So the data would be used to evaluate displacement risk with a focus on business owners of color and long-term business owners. This is a long-term project, so CBO recommended that the bureaus involved work together, develop a coordinated plan with holistic cost estimates, so, and that's with regards to the long-term project of the Southwest Corridor project as a whole. We recommend that the involved bureaus develop a coordinated plan with holistic cost estimates and present it to council for consideration during the budget development so that the costs may be evaluated in the context of the other funding needs.
So Director Kennard, let me address this for a second.
Sure.
And I'm going to channel my inner Joanne Hardesty. We've had a number of presentations on the Southwest Corridor Light Rail project. Here's what I know as of today. The legislature has closed the door on the preferred revenue source that Metro was considering to pay for it. The door has been shut tight and it will not be pried open. There is about a $400,000 delta right now in terms of planning for Southwest Corridor, which is going to require some value engineering or some tough choices or some other discussions. The next thing I'm going to say, I don't say to be provocative or disrespectful, but I've been around long enough that I am sincerely unclear who the champion is for this project. It's one thing to have staff come forward with presentations, and they're some of the best presentations that we get. I mean, they're superb. But I have a hard time really identifying who is the clear champion for this and whether it's going to go forward and whether these issues are going to get worked out. And in light of that, at some point, I want to be able to account for the money we're spending from different pots to move this thing along. Now, $50,000 is a modest amount of money, and I would imagine that a well-structured survey serves multiple purposes and not just light rail. But I want to put a marker down that I think we're getting close to a point where we need some clarity about the future. Because absent a clear plan to fund T2020, absent a clear champion, and I could go on and on, I'm beginning to have questions about the viability of this project. I think they are the correct questions to have. I'm not trying to be an obstructionist here, but every time we get a briefing, the assumption is we're moving something along, but I'm not sure to what end. So, Mayor, I just want to put that marker down, 50,000 here, 50,000 there, 100,000. I mean, at some point, it adds up to real money. And what we are effectively saying is this is a priority, and we're going to spend all this money in preparation for something that we have a high degree of confidence is going to happen. I, for one, am less and less confident about what the future holds, and am just worried about backing into something and then having it amount to nothing. So I just put that marker down and hope that we keep track of these expenditures in light of the uncertainty of the future path forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. You're not necessarily channeling your inner Commissioner Hardesty, although you may be, but you're certainly channeling your inner Mayor Wheeler. And I've had a number of conversations, I think, with some of my colleagues and certainly with Transportation Commissioner Udaly about this project and where it is and what the level of regional commitment is and what the likelihood is of actually securing a source of funding. Long story short, there's a bit of an internecine battle taking place around the regional table about where the project ends. And that is concerning both the viability of the project from a transit perspective as well as from a financing perspective. The second concern that I have is the question of where do you find the extra $400 million, which is now the delta, the current delta for that project, has been deftly turned over and dumped unceremoniously in the laps of the City of Portland representatives around that table. And the question put before the City of Portland is, do we want to shrink Southwest Barber Boulevard from 4 lanes to 2 lanes? And for me, to be honest with you, if you take the entirety of that corridor and you turn it into 2 lanes, that does not strike me as a viable or a reasonable alternative, although there are some other alignments currently being considered. I had a brief conversation with Chair Peterson. I know that she is interested in, President Peterson from the Metro Council. She's interested in making sure that all of the bodies that are represented around that table, including the City of Portland through Commissioner Udaly, that they are able to call that question. And I believe they take a vote very soon. I believe it's the first week of November. I don't know if Chris is here.
Yes,
I'm
I see
seeing
her head going up
head
and down,
nods. It is the first week of November that the region needs to decide. They're calling the question. They have to decide, are we going forward or not? And I concur with you, Commissioner Fish, that as of this particular moment, there are significant unresolved issues that lie ahead. For my part, my leadership on this project has been to insist that before we commit to the transportation component of this, we commit to the anti-displacement and affordability question and the commercial viability question through that entire corridor. And I believe the region has been highly respectful of that request, but the actual pieces related to the transportation infrastructure, which is the bigger question, has yet to be resolved.
Thank
Commissioner
you,
Hardesty.
Mayor. It looks like we got a 3-4 going down this road. I also have concerns about Prosper's proposal, both with Southwest and Division. Many bureaus talk about doing community engagement and hiring community engagement staff. I don't know if anybody has a handle on how many times are we going to the exact same communities, trying to engage those communities over and over and over again about a whole host of things. In Prosper's budget that was approved earlier this year, we gave Prosper money to do engagement around Division, the Division Transit Community Engagement Support. I don't know why Prosper putting money into a PBOT and TriMet scheme to engage people adds value. And again, some folks allocated $100,000 to the James Beard Market. And again, the legislature, for some ungodly reason, gave them $400,000. So the question is, can Prosper actually reorganize their budget? Because it doesn't sound like James Beard needs the $100,000 that was allocated, or was it $200,000? I can't remember. Because they were able to make a case in Salem. I just think that we could do a better job of coordinating community outreach so the community doesn't get tired of hearing from the City of Portland and these little one-off opportunities. And if we have professional civic engagement staff, shouldn't they be able to talk about more than one thing that the city's involved in when they go out and talk to the community? And so I think that's a bigger conversation. And Tom, I hope as we're talking about systems, that we talk about how do we engage the community so that the community is not exhausted by engaging with the City of Portland. Thank you.
All right, so the last item on the list is a $100,000 request for general fund one-time to provide businesses in outer division with support and technical assistance before and during the construction of the division transit project. So this was this was part of, included in the Portland Local Action Plan that was adopted by council back in July of 2016. However, no funding source was identified at the time. The Bureau, through partnership with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, was able to identify some grant funding to support the first 2 years of this initiative, but that funding has ended. And so they are requesting general fund support for this year and have indicated that they would be requesting general fund support for the next 2 years, which completes the 5-year duration of the plan. This is not an unforeseen need, but it is, it is a high priority, obviously, for the Bureau and for council. It's something that has been passed. CBO has recommended that the Bureau.
Jessica, you're talking too fast.
I'm sorry. Is that? I'm sorry. So.
That's me before coffee.
That's me on the last request, just trying to get through it. So the Bureau, this is not an unforeseen need, which is why the CBO didn't recommend it, but we do see it as a clear council priority. Council has committed to this action plan. So our recommendation is that the Bureau reallocate existing resources to fund this work.
Could we, is there somebody here from Prosper who could speak to this? All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So now moving on, the next item on the handout that you have is the encumbrance carryover request.
Jessica, can I make a request? The encumbrance carryover portion of the bump process tends to be the kind of, is the point in the presentation where everyone closes their eyes and leans back, and because it's so technical. Would you flag for us anything that we need to know that has a controversy attached to it? Because this is, in my experience, generally is pretty pro forma. But every once in a while, there's some issue, and I think it'd be helpful if you flagged. We can certainly tell if there's a discrepancy between the request and the recommendation, but if there's a larger policy question or something, I hope that you'll flag that for us. Otherwise, I know that this tends to go quickly, and it tends to be pretty pro forma.
Yeah, so thank you, Commissioner, for that. This is the encumbrance carryovers do follow a more prescriptive accounting rule and transaction. Essentially, therefore, services that bureaus have indicated through a purchase agreement that they would like to receive, but they haven't yet received those services at the close of the fiscal year. So they're meant to be for one-time needs that have been encumbered in a prior fiscal year. You'll note that there are a number of requests that CBO has reduced because we took a really close look as to whether or not those purchase orders were indeed one-time in nature for the receipt of services. So where it has been reduced was typically in examples where the request for services was either part of a bureau's ongoing budget or there was indication that the bureau was interested in carrying over the funds for additional and subsequent years. And so so there are a number of requests that are reduced for those reasons. I would highlight, if I were to highlight notable changes, let's see, so the Bureau of Portland Parks and Recreation has been reduced slightly, but that is to actually account for the sort of an agreement that I believe we came to with the Bureau on the actual intended cost. There was some challenge in this request, similar to the issue that Commissioner Fish alluded to around the other vehicles. A lot of these are requests for vehicles that were indicated that the Bureau wanted to purchase, but was not able to fully enter into a purchase agreement with Fleet before the end of the year. CBO has recommended that the cost, insofar as we know what the cost of those vehicles are, that we have recommended for the carryover of those resources. Another issue that I would flag and I wanted to highlight for council is that the Commissioner of Public Affairs, Commissioner Hardy's office, raised a really, I think, important conversation and issue with her encumbrance carryover request, which was for resources to fund outreach and engagement and community listening sessions. These are services that are obviously critical to you all as elected officials in doing your jobs. The CBO recommended the amount of funding that we assessed was necessary to complete a series of 5 outreach and engagement listening sessions that the commissioner is committed to. We did not recommend carryover for the resources that we understood that the Bureau intended or the commissioner intended to carry over for subsequent budget years, but we do recommend that council consider having a conversation about whether or not you all have the appropriate resources that you need to do the sort of community engagement and listening sessions, and we recommend that you take that up as part of next year's budget development process. So those are,
Commissioner Hardesty.
yes.
No, good. Where were you going next?
I was going to see if there were any other encumbrance areas that I would highlight or flag.
So I'd like to spend a little time just trying to understand the police budget better because of the, yesterday when Chief Outlaw was here, she talked about asset forfeiture funds that are part of their funding process. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, are we still carrying over the body cam money that we've been carrying over for several years, or is that actually an annual allocation?
So I believe, and I'm going to ask Katie to
there's
come up
somebody that
here,
can answer.
but there is both. There is an annual allocation that is included, an ongoing allocation that is part of the Bureau's budget, and they also did do a one-time carryover in this year, but Katie.
And can you tell me how much is the ongoing allocation?
Sure. Katie Scheifele, City Budget Office. So Jessica's correct. The one-time amount that was allocated several years ago and has been carried over multiple years is about $834,000. The original intent of that was to purchase equipment like body camera, sort of hardware. Since then, the Bureau's been allocated about $1.7 million ongoing to fund sort of like the development of a full body-worn camera program, including FDE and sort of ongoing costs associated with it.
But it is true that we, as of today, have no body cams. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, yeah.
So, of course, it begs the question, how are we spending $1.7 million a year on body cams that we don't actually have?
So I can speak to a little bit what I think the Bureau would say as far as their underspending last year, which I think is what you're asking. So as part of 18-19 budget development, if you'll recall, the Police Bureau had a number of new positions added. So they took sort of a one-time vacancy reduction there, and in the spring bump, we also took $2 million of their underspending and transferred that to an equipment replacement reserve. So generally speaking, I would say that the Police Bureau had about $4 million taken out of their budget sort of by other actions in 18-19 to get them to the underspending number that you're looking at. As far as where the body camera money itself went, I mean, from my perspective, at a sort of a high level, I would consider that sort of general underspending. But you can see sort of like the $2 million transfer in the spring bump for the region equipment replacement reserve is a potential offset for that.
So I understand that we've been using money to hire new officers to supplement overtime costs. I understand that we have asset forfeiture funds that are utilized. Can you tell me what the parameters are for asset forfeiture funds to be expended?
Sure, I can try. Someone from the Police Bureau might have a better sense than I do. My understanding is those are resources that can be used for one-time needs that are not sort of operational in nature, so they cannot be used to supplant sort of expenses the Bureau could normally be expected to have otherwise, including sort of like ongoing operations and things like that. But sort of one-time off-cycle things are appropriate.
And I have a question about, do we have a practice of expending federal dollars first before we expend general fund dollars? I ask that question because it's my understanding that we have $2 million that we're carrying over that came from federal resources, but we spent the marijuana tax dollars or cannabis tax dollars in lieu of actually spending the federal dollars first, and that was supposedly for traffic enforcement. Do I have that correct?
I'm not sure somebody from the Police Bureau wants to answer that. My understanding is that the sort of grants are a couple things associated with them. One, they're multiple years in nature, so it's sort of regular that they would carry those over from year to year. The piece about the cannabis tax, recreational cannabis tax revenue, I believe that supports straight time, officer straight time in the traffic division.
I'm sorry, you think it supports what?
Straight time for officers, so not overtime, straight time.
Straight.
Sorry, that's kind of a bureau speak, I guess.
Traffic, but it's straight time for traffic officers to do enforcement is what that money has been used for, is that correct?
Correct. And the piece about the grants is there's typically a match of straight time with sort of grant-funded overtime. And the issue, as far as I understand in the traffic division, is that there's not sort of the operational manpower necessarily to go after all of the grant money that is available.
So it's my understanding that you have not been fully able to expend the traffic enforcement grant. So that's really what I'm trying to get to, is like, so we're spending general fund first and then we hold on to the federal money?
Hi, Elizabeth Gallagher, Portland Police Bureau. That is correct. The grant funding at this point is to support overtime missions that have those specific parameters that go along with the grants, whereas the marijuana tax money is going to be supporting straight time enforcement in support of Vision Zero.
So the federal dollars can only be used for overtime, is that correct?
For those specific missions, correct?
For this specific mission?
Yes.
For traffic enforcement?
Yes.
Okay.
For the grants in question.
And so do you know how many hours we've spent in overtime and traffic enforcement over the last year?
I can get that number for you.
That would be helpful, because I'm just trying to understand, because we've got all these little pots of money, and you said the asset forfeiture was only used for one-time activities.
One-time activities that have to be law enforcement specific as well.
That have to be law enforcement specific?
Correct.
And so what does that look like in practice when we are spending the asset forfeiture dollars?
So we would be able to use it to stand up a new program, but we would not be able to use it for the ongoing expenses that would come of that program. So for example, if we were to have a one-time expense to purchase equipment for something, we could use it for that. However, you would not be able to use it for the ongoing annual expenses that would come of maintaining that.
So we could use the asset forfeiture funds to buy equipment on a one-time basis, is that correct?
Correct.
So it looks like we've got about $7 to $8 million set aside in the Police Bureau's budget that is supposed to be used. I see a couple of places where it's talking about the new data system, and we have a moderate level of confidence. And we say it's going to cost $5 million for this new data system.
That's the low confidence estimate based on a consultant's work to help us determine that cost.
But as of today, we've got about $8 million in Portland Police Bureau's budget that's actually designated specifically for the replacement of that data system, or that could be used to replace that data system.
So right now, there's $2 million sitting in a sub-fund that's set aside as equipment replacement for the Police Bureau.
Right.
And the intent is to use that for replacement of the records management system.
Right.
The part of the bump request before you is to transfer another $2 million, right? So that action has yet to be taken, but that's the proposal in the bump. As far as the balance of asset forfeiture reserves that are available and can be used specifically for the records management system, I believe that number to be around $4 million, but we would need to verify that.
That's what I was anticipating, $4 to $5 million in asset forfeiture funds, $1.1 million in special revenue funds, and $2 million already set aside. And so, it just feels like there's a lot of money within the Portland Police Bureau that's budgeted for the exact same thing. And so for me, I need some clarity about, I think first, Mayor, we need some clarity around whether we're ever gonna have a body cam program. Because the fact that we have ongoing funding for a program for 3 years that we've never actually implemented is problematic for me.
Well, let me ask this. Is there an interest on the part of the council to have a work session on body-worn cameras? Because I would be very interested in that conversation.
Yeah.
Is there an
I would
interest?
be very
Perfect.
interested in having that
Good.
conversation too,
Excellent.
so we could finally put it to rest. So that would be helpful. I think that's a big thing for me, that we're continuing to fund something that we've never had and that we have, in my estimation, somewhere between $4 to $5 million that is wiggly, and that maybe could be put to Portland Street Response or to other efforts that we're working on.
Well,
So-
let's be clear here. The Police Bureau has moved forward on the body-worn camera program. The holdup has been labor negotiations. That's been a significant part of it. But I think it would be very worthwhile for us to have a thorough discussion about body-worn cameras.
As do I.
We had a group of people here for a work session earlier this week who were telling us about some of their thoughts and ideas around labor practices. But I noticed on their larger screen, in terms of police accountability, one of their top priorities was body-worn cameras. So it'd be interesting to get different perspectives and ideas around this. But I'd love to, we should call this question.
Yes, we should. Thank you.
And I was just going to address as well, to the extent that the Bureau has been working towards the body-worn camera program, there was a meeting with the PPA on October 1st. The timeline beyond that will be to take the policy that has been discussed through that to the stakeholders group, in addition to providing information to council on that policy. It's anticipated that the policy would be able to be, the policy piece would continue through the end of the calendar year, and then we'd be able to look towards putting out an RFI or an RFP in the spring of 2020.
One of the things that needs to be part of that work session is the timeline, because we do have a timeline. We have a proposal for the RFP, the pilot for 200 cams, an evaluation process for that pilot, a time frame to bring it back to the council. But I feel like we need to have that conversation so that everybody's got the same baseline and we're on the same page.
Yes, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with that. I think what's problematic is that, again, the city council has not actually passed a policy around body cams, and that is our responsibility. There was a commitment made to the community that we would have a body cam policy before we actually bought the first body cam. And what Portland Police has done so far has not been effective in engaging the community around what a body cam policy should look like. I have a detailed letter from ACLU and others that actually lays out what has happened so far, and I just want to say that it just has not been the process that Mayor Hales actually promised the community that they would have. So I look forward to, Mayor, working with you to put together that work session, because we have to call the question. We're wasting way too many resources on something we don't have.
All right, it's a fair discussion and we should have it. It's getting a little far afield from what today's work session is.
Well, except that my question
Commissioner
is, thank you
Fritz.
for this conversation. Thank you for agreeing to have the work session. Presumably, we can't have the work session until before we pass the bump. Is
No.
it possible? So we've got $2 million here, kind of continuing to punt that forward as part of the bump. What would happen if we have a work session, after the bump, we decide we're not going to do that, that would then get clawed back in a future adjustment. Is that correct?
So the current proposal and what the commissioner is referring to is under other adjustments. In the third line, there's a $2 million transfer request, and it's a transfer request of existing PPP resources, which includes an allocation for body cams. The Bureau is anticipating not needing those resources this year, so putting them towards the records management system replacement.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
No, please.
So the process would be, if this bump was approved, that money would be set aside. It's money that the Bureau does not anticipate needing in the current year. It's set aside in a reserve.
Okay.
Council can always choose to allocate those resources towards something else if they determine later that there is a different outlook or a different priority.
Great, thank you. That's very
Great.
clear.
And I will just say this, it's been the policy of this council since 2015 that we would move forward with this pilot, and a tremendous amount of work, time, and energy has gone into paving the way for this pilot. But if the current council does not agree that we should have the body-worn cameras, and we disagree with the policy of 2015, and we disagree about the accountability that the council believed in 2015, and which I still believe today, body-worn cameras would bring to policing, we should have that conversation. If it's not the will of the majority of the council, I can live with it, but I think we need to have the conversation, because I still support it. Or at least the pilot. What we've committed to is getting through the pilot and evaluating it here in the city of Portland as an accountability tool.
Thank you, Mayor. I also look forward to us having the work session because I think what we found around the country is that with or without body cams, people are still losing their lives.
Well, we're not going to solve the debate today.
No, we
We're-
won't.
We're committing, you and I will obviously continue this conversation. It's a good conversation.
for a long time.
Indeed, we have, and we'll continue to have it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, thank you both.
So the next section of the document that we're walking through is returns to the general fund. This reflects packages that return resources to the general fund for various reasons. Most of these are just true-ups.
I'm sorry, which one are you on, Jessica?
We are on the portrait document with the shades. It's returns to the general fund under encumbrance carryovers. So it starts with, there's a $726,000 return. These are funds that are coming back to the general fund, either due to true-ups or to correct for accounting transactions.
And what does true up mean?
So in the case of, for example, the Portland Water Bureau's cash transfer to the general fund, that is, we have a general fund allocation that we give to the Water Bureau to pay for operations at Dodge Park. Every year, they look at their books and they see actually how much money they actually required, and they pay this general fund back for the money that they didn't require.
Thank you.
Except we're no longer doing that, so this is the last year you'll be seeing that.
Oh,
So
okay.
now we're not
So
doing
I
overnight.
shouldn't learn it? I should
Yeah,
just
don't
unlearn it
don't
after this
spend too
budget?
much.
Don't worry about it, that's right.
In addition to what's listed on this report, I did want to note that, that council had set aside $500,000 in a policy set aside for Parks Bureau encumbrances last year in the event that they were not able to meet their year-end balance because of the issues that they were working with. And because of, as the commissioner stated, they were able to come in under budget, that resource is not needed. And so that money is also being transferred back to general fund unrestricted contingency. And so you'll see that in the final contingency balance. Okay. So moving on to other adjustments, this category includes requests that fall under the following major categories. They're technical adjustments. They are truing up contractual funding commitments that have already been authorized by council, so things that council has already authorized. They are carryover of fees and other non-discretionary revenue that's collected in the general fund. And there are other transfers that generally between bureaus or between funds that don't impact the general fund contingency. So what you see here, the first one is the water main break claims. You'll recall that during the over expenditure ordinance, council decided to set aside resources to pay for claims related to the water main break on March 16th, 2019. This is, we set aside $250,000. This request represents the claims that have been paid out to date. In addition, there will be a few more claims, and the Bureau will come forward, the Attorney's Office will come forward with a final request for the remainder of the needed resources during the spring bump. The Bureau of Emergency Communications is requesting a transfer of $78,000 in public safety, the PSSRP, I'm trying to remember the acronym, too many acronyms. It's a pool of resources.
Excuse me,
that-
Jessica, can I go
Yes.
back for just a sec? The water main break claim, I'm assuming that the $133,000 that you discussed
Yes.
has more to do with legal services as compared to paying claims out?
Paying the claims.
Oh, it is paying claims?
Yeah.
paying
Remember that
claims.
ordinance we passed?
Welcome.
Oh, ta-da. Good morning. Put your mic on, Dan. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Hi.
My name is Dan Simon. I'm an attorney with the City Attorney's Office, and I've been working on processing the water main claims for our office.
Wonderful. And is it appropriate? I just want to ask some questions about how many claims are we getting? Are we done? Do we expect more? What's your analysis?
So after the deadline that was set by the council for submitting claims, we ended up with approximately, we had 14 claims, of which some of those claims are in the nature of asserting power outage damages, which the ordinance specifically provides the city will not pay. We were then left with 8 claims that asserted claims for damages that would be covered by the ordinance. Of those 8 claims, we have settled 4 of them. There is one more that is very close to being settled. There is another one that is in process, and then there are a couple of other claims where we've reached out to the claimants but haven't received any kind of contact from them.
So the deadline has passed, so you don't anticipate any more claims coming in?
The deadline for submitting new claims has passed. The deadline for when the claims are supposed to be fully processed is October 14th.
It's October 14th, so coming up relatively soon.
Yes.
You know, I know how big that hole was in North Portland, and I'm pretty sure that there were more than 14 households that were impacted by it. How did we let people know that they could file a claim and for damages based on the water pipes?
So per the ordinance, all the claims that had originally been submitted to RISC were then transferred over to the city attorney's office. Our office, we reached out to those who had made a claim. There was some media coverage, I recall, over the passage of the ordinance itself, but we did not affirmatively reach out to that entire neighborhood and ask people if they were willing to submit claims.
Is there someone from water that can answer that question?
I can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I was interviewed on Straight Talk about it. I did several news interviews on the television. It was in, I think, the Oregonian Willamette Week. It was fairly, people were interested because it was a spectacular break that got lots of good video coverage. So, you know, to the extent that people are following the media, we're pretty confident that, and plus we asked the, I was in touch by email with the person who had the biggest damages and encouraged him to make sure that people would, his neighbors would send in their claims.
Good. Just knowing what a low-income community that was and just many elderly people and people with disabilities, I was just very concerned that they knew that there was a process and they could be made whole. So thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to highlight a couple, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner.
In the interest of time, because again, some of these look
Yes.
mind-numbingly just technical. I have a question about special appropriations, open and accountable elections. So the 950,000, Commissioner Fritz, that's the amount that you sought that had been set aside but not forwarded to the program. Is that the $950,000 that you sought to fund this cycle?
Yes, that the council used for other purposes the first year of the cycle, so we're just asking for it back.
And are you confident that with the $950,000 we can fully fund this cycle?
No. We won't know. We have 7 candidates participating so far, and it's the first time we're through, so we don't know.
Participating, but not necessarily eligible.
We don't have anybody who's certified as yet.
Right.
And we also don't know how well candidates are going to be able to use the program to fundraise and get matched. So we are hopeful that this will do it, but if you say, am I certain, the answer is no.
Okay, and all right, that's honest. And then if there was a shortfall, when would you bring that forward and in what manner?
Let me ask Susan Mote to come up and tell you that, but she can correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe what we set in the ordinance in the code is that the director has the discretion to lower the match. So that's the process that we're anticipating right now.
Yes, the code does require.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Susan Matei, Director of Open and Accountable Elections. The code does require the director, prior to lowering the match, asking the council for the amount of funding that would be required to keep the match rate 6-1, and if turned down, would then lower the match.
You'd lower the match. And do you anticipate making a request for additional funding for staff?
No.
So you don't anticipate, so if for example, the technology issues have not been worked out to your satisfaction, you don't anticipate asking for additional staff to do paper input?
The technology the city needs to administer the program automatically has already been delivered. The remaining pieces are to make the campaign's lives easier, bulk export to ORSTAR, and finishing out the public data visualizations. So technology-wise, we're fine.
And no, we don't need any more staff for that.
If a campaign qualifies, let's say it's a sophisticated campaign, well-resourced, and they not only are certified, but they qualify for the full match as soon as possible. They would get the full match?
if I lower the match rate, it's for all campaigns starting on a certain day. So any contributions they collected, say, starting on November 1, would be matched at a lower rate. So yes, I mean, the earlier someone were to hit their public match cap, if they did that prior to a match rate being lowered, then they would end up getting matched 6-1 for that particular election.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so again, in the interest of time, I think we're going to move on unless there are questions about any of the other
Are we going to spend a little
adjustments.
time on the budget notes?
Oh, yes. So we're going to move on to talk about contingency balance, and then we'll talk about the allocation level, the CAL target adjustments. Is that your, what you're referring to, Commissioner? And then we will spend some time talking about positions. Okay. So moving on to the excess balance and contingency with CBO recommendation worksheet. This is what this document looks like. So we start with the official ending balance number. As we have discussed, there are encumbrances and advances that we've gone through that are sort of taken out of that resource. We are also required to true up our short-term rental revenue, are transferred to the Housing Investment Fund. There are a series of other adjustments that are made. And then we end up with an available balance number. We compare it to our budgeted beginning fund balance, and then we end up with an excess balance number of $11.1 million. Per financial policy, half of that excess balance is deposited into our capital set-aside account for allocation to capital projects. There was a change in financial policy whereby we are now allocating those resources only in the spring through budget development process, so that money will stay in that account and will be bolstered by any available one-time resources in the forecast. And then we will do one allocation process through budget development. And then 50% goes to unrestricted contingency. So you'll see here in this bottom box, what we end up with is we have a starting balance for unrestricted contingency of just under $1.7 million. Then the contingency after all of the excess fund balance and the returns to the general fund puts us at $8.7 million. With CBO recommended funding, we have a reduction of $3.9 million so that leaves us with a total unrestricted contingency balance of $4.8 million.
I just want to tell people at home who don't have this paper in front of them that the short-term rental, commonly known as Airbnb tax, is putting over $5 million into the Housing Investment Fund. So for people who are kind of irritated about that use happening in their neighborhoods, I want you to know that there's $5 million going into affordable housing because of it.
And is that in excess of the 1.2 million that is, yeah, so it's actually 6.2 million because we have an assumed $1.2 million allocation already. Nice. So, yeah, so we end up with what can be seen as somewhat of a sizable balance, but I would like to, take this opportunity to remind council that there are a number of one-time issues that we know exist for the upcoming budget cycle. So the Joint Office of Homeless Services, anti-displacement work. There are a number of projects that we know council is interested in funding. So although it might seem like a decent amount of available balance, we would certainly recommend that council try to preserve as much of this resource as possible for funding your priorities in next year's budget cycle. Moving on, there are also, as I mentioned, a small number of current appropriation level target adjustments. These are referred to as CAL adjustments. These are requests to increase Bureau's general fund allocation levels for next year on an ongoing basis. There are three requests. Two of them were directed that bureaus bring forward these requests through last year's budget process. So the first one is increasing the CAL target by $1.8 million in the Office of Management and Finance's Revenue Division to support the integrated tax system. So this was directed, again, by Council Action. Council also invested significant one-time resources in the budget to buy down this ongoing cost. And this is the number that has now been settled upon as the general fund portion of the cost. And so Council also directed the Bureau to pursue cost sharing, which means that every fund that they collect revenues on behalf should share a portion of the cost. So this assumes just the general fund liability or the general fund portion of those costs. That amount, I will note, will be pulled back on a one-time basis. Not all of that funding is required in this first year, but we would recommend that we allocate all of the ongoing resources now and then pull back what's not needed on a one-time basis. Second, there is a request to modify the CalTarget calculation methodology for Portland Parks and Recreation to include inflationary increases for fee-supported recreation services staff, resulting in an estimated increase of $500,000 or $1 million annually.
So if I could just take a moment to address this, I'm going to ask Claudio come up once again to fact-check the commissioner. And Portland Parks and Recreation is putting this on the table now primarily to salt the discussion going forward, and we fully anticipate that you'll want to know more about this, but will likely want to take this up in the regular budget process, so we understand that. But we didn't want to miss an opportunity to at least put a marker down and lay out the case. And if I could, Mayor, just take a moment. Current appropriation level adjustments means that citywide, every year, we increase the CAL by all the inflationary factors, including healthcare, cost of living adjustments, PERS, which is retirement, and other expenses. So for almost all programs funded by the general fund, these costs are built into the Bureau's base budget or current appropriation level, or CAL, annually. That means that you start the budget cycle with last year's CAL plus inflation and other factors built in. And so you are already adjusting for those factors, which, in the absence of which, you'd actually see a reduction in your CAL target. Now, the bureaus do not need to request these funds. Under our system, they are simply baked into the way the CAL is calculated, the current appropriation level target adjustments. This is done automatically so that every year you start at the head of the stretch with an increased appropriation. As we learned this year during the budget process, the situation at Parks is different and unique. Many of our most important programs and employees are funded not by the general fund, but by program fees and revenues. In fact, 50% of the cost of our recreation programs is funded by fees. Without CAL increases for these fees, we are essentially leaving it to the Bureau to raise revenues to cover the inflationary costs. But at the same time, the council's been clear that we want to keep fees low enough so that no door is closed to anyone in our community that wants to use our system. That is the fundamental challenge in making a budget in the Parks Bureau. Now, there are market forces at work here as well, but here's the bottom line. There is simply no way within our current system that program fees and revenues can keep pace with personnel costs and that we can continue to stay competitive and accessible. And as a result, we have a structural gap. And the structural gap was discussed at length during the budget process. To address that structural gap, I have directed the Bureau to request that all inflationary increases, regardless of the source of funding, be factored into their CAL. And this is a little edgy, and I know it doesn't quite fit into, our thinking, but frankly, I think Parks has been shortchanged for too long in being told to essentially go use fees to cover their costs, but not to be treated like everyone else when it comes to CAL target adjustments. Now, the CBO has recommended that we begin this conversation, but that we really postpone any decision-making until the spring when we put the budget together, and we understand the logic of that. But what I want to do today, colleagues, is I want to put a marker down so that we can begin to think about this concept. Is it workable? Does it make sense? Is it fair and responsible? The one thing I know is that if we were to do this, we would make our programs more sustainable to the tune of about $500,000 to $1 million annually. And we would effectively be treated like every other bureau that is funded by the general fund, with the exception that Parks, unique among the bureaus, has a mix of general fund and fee revenue that maintains its service. So that's the concept. We're not here to convince you of its merit today, but we are here to begin the conversation. Claudio, would you like to add anything?
No, Commissioner, I think you got that right. I would say that while Parks may not be unique in this, there are a number of other bureaus that do raise fees. We're probably unique in the scale of the fees.
Well, let me be clear, and I'm not trying to drive a wedge between bureaus, but for example, the Bureau of Transportation does rely on fees, but they also have the opportunity every year to set parking rates, both in facilities, in structured parking, and on the streets, in such a way as to cover the necessary revenue to meet their projections. We simply do not have the same flexibility to increase fees. And if you look at the inflationary factors in the last year where we got hit with a big PERS increase on top of COLA and healthcare and other things, I think the number, Director Kennard, correct me if I'm wrong, was the total inflationary package about 9%?
In terms of the funding gap?
Yeah, no, in terms of what, in terms of the Cal targets, what was the bump that everyone got to deal with all of the cost drivers of PERS, healthcare, and other things? I think it was somewhere in the area of 8 to 9%.
That sounds familiar.
Was
yes.
baked in.
Yeah.
We simply don't have the luxury to raise our fees 8 to 9% a year going forward. And so what we're asking is for a rethinking of what we mean when we talk about current appropriation level targets. Who should be covered by the adjustments, and is it fair to leave parks behind? And again, I'm not here to close the argument today. I'm here just to salt the discussion, and we look forward to having follow-up conversations with my colleagues about this idea.
So thank you, Commissioner, for explaining that. Is this for the coming 2021 budget?
We'll put this back on the table in the normal budget cycle.
So are you asking for this budget note in the bump so that in the 20 to 21?
No, we're using the excuse of the opportunity. We're being opportunistic. We're using the opportunity to put a budget note down, which we know will not get any traction in the fall bump, to frame the issue. We intend to raise this in the regular budget cycle and to see whether the council has any interest in pursuing it and to discuss it in greater detail. But all we're doing now is flagging it.
Okay, that's helpful. And because I know that you and your bureau and the community have been doing a lot of work to look at what other revenue sources might there be for parks.
So we'll be coming back for a work session in November. What we can tell you is that under the most optimal circumstances and the most aggressive timelines, we're not going to have in place a fix for our structural deficit within the next budget cycle. It's just not possible. And we're looking at a situation now where the 2020 budget, the 2020 ballot is going to be a 5,000, it's going to look like a phone book when it gets to your house.
That's right.
With all the things. So we need some breathing room, both to get to consensus about what a new funding model might look like, and also have the time, if it requires new revenue, to galvanize the community. This would be an interim fix.
So that's what I'm trying to clarify. Are you asking for this to be adopted as a budget note now so that it applies to the 2021 budget?
No.
That would be great, but I know it's not going to happen. What we're going to do is raise this again during the 2020 budget in hopes of getting a budget note.
Then let me ask for clarity from the City Budget Office. Are number 1 and 3 proposed to be adopted now?
Correct, yes, they are. Well, so actually, with number 3, if I may, it's for the 311 system, and so.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
just, are we finished? Have we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we did make the request for, in order to be incorporated in the Cal targets that are developed for the 2021 process, but as the Commissioner indicated, we recognize that this is a big ask, and so to the degree that it's not possible or not something that Council wants to consider at this point, we understand. We really just wanted to put a marker down and talk about that as we move forward into the conversation in November. We've got a work session scheduled for November 19th to really discuss the broader options around funding the park.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Time check, 15 minutes.
Yes. So, and Commissioner, to your question, number 1 is a request to increase Cal for the the Office of Management and Finance, which is action that council will be looking to take and vote on in the fall supplemental budget. Number 3 is actually a slightly different approach. We wanted to highlight it because it was directed in a budget note that the bureaus bring forward a 311 program CAL target adjustment. However, the action will be taken actually separately, taken up by council on the 16th, on October 16th, with the resolution that outlines the entire program. So it's going to be happening actually on the same day at council, but it won't, the action to increase their CAL will not happen through the supplemental budget ordinance. It will happen through the separate resolution that folks are bringing on 311.
Can I just ask a question, because I'm finding myself, I'm becoming increasingly forgetful about certain things. Has the council made a definitive decision that 311 should be housed at the Office of Community and Civic Life?
Hi, I'm Michelle Koenig North with OMF and the project manager for the 311 implementation. To answer your question, council appropriated funding to start up the program in the 1920 adopted budget in the Office of Community and Civic Life. Part of the resolution that we're bringing forward on October 16th would formally establish that program, and we are currently recommending housing the customer service 311 program in that office, but with joint leadership with the Office of Management and Finance.
Okay, and that's based on an action the council has taken directing OMF to place 311 at the Office of Community and Civic Life?
No, so that's a decision that would be in front of council as part of that resolution on the 16th.
I'm sorry, it's a decision what?
That would be in front of council as part of the resolution on October 16th.
So we will be taking up that question as part of the resolution?
Correct.
And you'll be asking us to move it from OMF to the Office of Community and Civic Life?
OMF was directed to lead the implementation planning effort back in, I believe, the 17-18 budget. Since then, through our implementation planning, we are making the recommendation that the program be housed within the Office of Community and Civic Life.
I look forward to that conversation, because why is my first question, but okay, we'll talk.
Well, and if I can just follow up, so I guess I'm not being as forgetful as I advertised. What would be helpful to me, if we're going to take this up on a fairly accelerated schedule, is to better understand OMF's thinking on this, what alternatives were considered, whether a standalone office was considered and what the pluses and minuses of that, whether there's another bureau that also could be a good fit. I don't have any information currently that allows me to make a decision one way or another whether this is a good idea, but I'm very interested in having some prompting as to why OMF thinks this is a good idea, and I'd like to hear from the commissioner in charge and my colleagues, but I could imagine 311 being placed in a number of settings, and frankly, there's some core questions that I would have around capacity, mission creep, other core expertise, all kinds of things. And apparently, I imagine OMF has done some of that thinking. So I would urge you to share some of your thinking before the hearing, because a resolution is a hearing and a vote, and it doesn't give us a lot of time to be deliberative. And I'd like to know more before the 16th.
Me too.
We are happy to provide that.
And I will just say that when I was in charge of the Office of Neighbourhood Involvement and the champion for 311, I did not think it should be in the Office of Neighbourhood Involvement.
All right, so it sounds like we have a conversation we need to, as a council, have about this issue, and I'm pleased that you flagged it in the budget note. Otherwise, it would have gone right over my
So
head.
I'll go one step farther. And Tom is not still here, is he? No. So what I will just reflect, I will channel what I think I'm hearing. I think that the bar is high, and that there's a degree of skepticism on the part of the council as to whether that is the right move. And so, Tom, I know you're out there somewhere listening, because I know you have nothing better to do than listen to our work sessions. You hear the challenge.
Yes.
And so I think there needs to be some good discussions amongst the council offices and a very clear presentation when we do have that presentation that lays that case out clearly. I'll just put one sort of interesting tidbit in the center of the table. I know that OMF has looked at a number of different scenarios, and there is actually no particularly neat fit with any existing bureau. And in fact, we started this conversation, I remember, with the old saying that came from several years ago in the Office of Neighborhood Involvement, where a prior director of that bureau had once described it as something like the island of misfit toys. Whenever there was a new program or a new proposal and it didn't neatly fit into a particular bureau, it always seemed to migrate to the then Office of Neighborhood Involvement, and not necessarily with the right capacity or resources or a good connection or fit with that bureau and its culture and its actual mission. And so there may be a little bit of this going on there as well. OMF, on the other hand, I think will make a case to us as a council that they're not necessarily the best fit. But this is a very important conversation, and it is one that we should absolutely have. So Tom, if you're out there, just want to tee you up for that conversation.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that information and look forward to talking more about that. I want to, because I realize we're looking like we're packing up, I just want to put a marker down to have a conversation about bureaus that are required to have a 24/7 workforce and what the maximum hours of overtime should be. And so just speaking from the Fire Bureau perspective, where we have people who are on shift for 24 hours, and we have some stations where people's sleep is interrupted like every hour or two, and so they can never actually get good sleep. So sleep deprivation is a huge issue for them. I know that people who work more than 50, 60, 70 hours a week cannot be effective in their job. And so it would be really incumbent upon us as a city council to think about what the maximum hours of overtime any employee, especially those who are first responders, can work, because all the wellness data tells us that after a certain period of time, people are not functioning at their best. And so I hope that we have an opportunity as we start, not through this bump process, but as we start preparing for the regular budget, that we are very thoughtful about limiting those 24/7 first responders to what is the maximum number of hours that makes sense, so that the community can feel confident when those first responders show up. They are healthy, they are ready to do the job that they're showing up to do. So thank you for that. So that's number one. Number two, I want to reiterate the need for us to have a citywide community engagement program that actually identifies both funding resources for those organizations that don't have the capacity to support coming to city meetings on a regular basis, and make sure that we're not falling over each other as we go to talk to people in communities about a whole variety of issues. And so I'm hoping that as we prepare for the next budget, that we can have some really thoughtful conversations about this.
If I may say something, this is Kofi again, sitting for Dr. Marquisha Smith, Office of Equity and Human Rights. The community engagement is one of the equity goals that the City Council adopted in 2015 as a binding policy for each bureau. But what we realize is that bureaus are having a hard time implementing, achieving those goals because of the lack of resources. So I think the City Budget Office has did that discussion with our Office of Equity and Human Rights to see how to capture the expenses that the bureaus are, having around community engagement. The Office of Community and Civic Lives has a team now that is very, very robust, developing strategies and how to support bureaus in achieving the community engagement, goals. So what I would recommend is to keep including the Office of Equity and Human Rights and the City Budget Office to guide the bureaus on how to really identify how they are allocating resources in their budget to community engagement. One thing I want to end with is usually the outreach work is more transactional than relational, and communities expect relational outreach approach to transactional. Transactional means when there is a project, they go out to the community and they talk to them, and then that's the end of it. Yeah. So, but to sustain the relationship, we need a different approach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kofi.
Great. So in our last couple of minutes, I just wanted to highlight for council that there are a handful of position changes that are being requested as part of the supplemental budget. So in total, we
Can you give a few sentences about that, just so if people from the community are listening, they know what we're talking about?
Sure. So, council approves a certain level of positions for each bureau. If a bureau would like to add a position, it needs to be a permanent full-time position. It needs to be approved by council. So a number of bureaus are coming at this time to request position approval. Most notably, most of them are, there's the Office of the City Attorney is adding one position. Bureau of Environmental Services is adding one position. The Housing Bureau requested one position. CBO is recommending it's related to a one app, the resources freed up from a one app fee contract. They have the resources still, they can move forward with a limited term position. And that's what CBO is recommending that they do. Office of Management and Finance is adding one position, and Portland Parks and Recreation is adding 4.5 positions. That is actually related to positions that were previously approved but didn't get into the system in time. And then most notably, the Bureau of Transportation is adding 28 positions total. And
Why
these-
28? Are they contracting in?
So it's actually to meet increased workload demands in a variety of divisions, in maintenance, development, permitting and transit, engineering, parking, business services, and policy and planning projects. So it's a little bit of positions throughout the organization, primarily funded through fees, although some general transportation revenue is going to support these. So I know that in the interest of time, we don't have much time left, but we are happy to follow up with individual conversations with you all about any of these changes. So with that, the next step is, the mayor will be filing his proposed supplemental budget next week, as he mentioned. We will be having our hearing on the following Wednesday, October 16th. Our office is available to answer any questions, any follow-up questions that you might have around the request or our recommendations. And with that,
So what's our deadline? Can you just remind us, what's the deadline for us seeking to be included in the mayor's proposed? When will he be finalizing that?
we are looking to finalize it with him on Monday so that he may file on Tuesday.
So between now and Monday, we need to make our case on anything that we're asking him to consider putting in his proposed, with the backstop that we can always bring an amendment when it comes back to council.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice
Great.
job.
Thank you, everybody. Good conversation. Thanks, everybody who gave us further insight and information. We're adjourned.